right away after the count off. Really play it slow, somewhere. Well, okay, not quite that slow. Somewhere in between there and the last one. Almost cut my hair.
All right, good morning. Last class, welcome. You've made it through. Are y'all taking summer classes? You ready to roll right back into more remote learning? All right. If you haven't already, I think we've talked about this a couple times, but Summer Momentum Plan. If you're a full-time student, you can get 9 free credits this summer. And even if you have less than, if you're a part-time student right now, you can still get free summer classes, which is different. They changed that. So even if you didn't meet the requirements for Summer Momentum like a month ago, you probably do now. So Summer Momentum, register for those free summer classes. They have to be academic. I usually tell people to like take the online walking class, but apparently they won't pay for that. And for the fall, you know that you have more flexibility for paying. So it'll be more flexible to pay in installments. And there's a grants to cover you if you owe the college $500 or less right now. Like if you have an old bill, you can get forgiveness for that. And last but certainly not least, if you need, if you've been affected by coronavirus, like having trouble with rent or groceries, or you need stuff to be online this summer, you need a better computer so you can do your online classes, you definitely want to apply for that student emergency aid. The college got a large grant from the federal government under the CARES Act. So you should apply for that. And I posted information on how to apply for that. If you're not, if you can't get that because if you don't have a social security number or other reasons, then there's some information in that announcement too about other paths to help you out. So the college is very committed to keeping you in school, so not letting this derail your education plans. So lots of ways to get help for that. Check out the announcement that I posted like last week, if you haven't already, about that emergency student financial aid that you might qualify for. If you haven't registered for summer or fall yet, go ahead and get registered. Like I said, you are almost certain, if you are here right now and you are in good standing, if your GPA is 2.0 or higher, you can get free summer classes. So definitely sign up for that. If you signed up for summer classes and you still have a bill, that should fall off in a couple of weeks. And if not, then you just want to email the bursar and they'll be around to help you out. Okay, so any last minute questions before we jump into stuff? We're just going to talk about the reading quiz and wrap up. Okay, if anything occurs to you, let me know. All right, so about half of you are still working on the Guerrilla Girls background reading, which is fine. It's not due till the end of the day. It is tricky. The readings are dense. I've gotten, so this was the first time I made this quiz just for this. It's the first time anyone's taken this quiz. And I have gotten some feedback that like the true or false are really tricky. So pay attention to that and feel free when you submit it, you can put comments and feel free to be like, oh, this is what I was thinking. This was my interpretation of that. I would love to read that and take that into account. So pay attention to the true or false and pay attention to the comments that pop up from me. So when you submit your answer, you should see like immediate feedback about what I was thinking with that true and false. So pay attention to those. I'm more interested with you engaging with the material than necessarily getting every single point. If you feel like you made a sincere effort and you did poorly, like I said, put a little comment in, let me know how you interpreted stuff. That'll be really helpful to me, and I'll take that into consideration as I grade as well. That quiz was largely an effort for me to take really complex ideas and turn them into true or false questions, which obviously I need to work harder on. Okay, so the other things that you have, do some chapter content quizzes. There's an extra credit assignment if you want to take advantage of that. But otherwise, and I just updated this, so you probably haven't seen it yet, but otherwise in the Guerrilla Girls in Our Midst module, you'll see the final exam option A. And that is what I want you to do with your roll sheet. And what you're going to do is create a really short artist or critic statement, 200 to 250 words. That's about a double-spaced page that explains your fundamental stance, your characters, your roles, fundamental stance on the purpose of art. And it should be based on the information in your roll sheet. Although if you want to do some outside research on your artist, I'm fine with that. And then you'll create a response to that central question from the Nochlin reading. Why have there been no great women artists, that she asked in 1971? And your response should stay in character. So you can create a piece of art in the style of your artist. And if you're not an artist, I understand. So you can create a piece of art in the style of your artist that responds to that question, or create a magazine article in the style of an art magazine. Honestly, whatever you want to do. This is like, you're my first class that's ever done this, and we were supposed to do it in class. So I'm like, really what you want to do to express your character's response to that question. But stay in the 80s. Don't talk about stuff from the 90s or the 2000s. Really try and stay in the 80s, Cold War, nuclear proliferation, drug war, AIDS crisis, Reaganomics. Stay there. And you can come to the final exam period if you want to display your work. You'll submit it, but if you want to display it and show it to anyone else, you can come to the final exam period. But it's not going to be mandatory, because I also created an option B. So this is option A. This was what I originally planned for y'all. Well, I changed the plans after we went remote. But this is final option A. Option B is if you're feeling like you're just not connecting with your artist, or you just don't want to make something creative right now. I understand. And if you want another option, you can do this short answer exam. That's of course open note, not timed. You can only submit it once. And the exam is a series of short answers, analysis of 4 ID terms and 3 images. So you would pick 3 images to analyze out of these images. And each one of these you would relate to an ID term from down here. So you would also choose 4 ID terms and analyze them. Who, what, when, where, what's the significance? Who, what, when, where, what's the significance, and which of these would you connect it to, and why is it connected? So this is just an option B if you just do not want to do the option A, the creative work. Regardless of which option that you choose, you are still responsible for the background reading. So this is still required. But instead of option A, instead of the in character thing, you could just do this exam. And this exam turns out to be a lot of writing. It's 7 little paragraphs. If you put it all together, it turns out to be like 5 pages at least. So it's a lot of writing, but it's writing that you could do in chunk and just respond to the ones that you want to write about. Okay, questions. This is also due later. This is not due till Thursday. The option A is due on Monday. If you take option A, it's due on Monday. I think the benefit to option A is it's really whatever you want to make of it. Option B, the benefit is you have a little bit more time and it's a little bit more straightforward. So questions? Really? No questions? All right. Everyone feel confident? You should. You should feel very confident. I only see 3 faces, so I don't know how confident everyone's feeling, but you should feel good. You should feel confident. You've made it through. All right. Otherwise, make sure you get any late work turned in the next couple of days, because I am going to close. I'm going to start applying late fees. So I've waived late fees. If you have late fees that are affecting your grade, I'm going to take a look at those when I finalize your grades, and probably waive them. But I do want you to get any late work stuff, any late stuff, missing stuff turned in the next couple of days for me. All right, awesome. Let me just do like a little last lecture. I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the new right. I know we skipped some stuff because I wanted to get us to the 80s, and I wanted to give you more time to work on those background readings. And the 2 background readings that we've read are really a feminist and an anti-feminist perspective from Nochlin and Phyllis Schlafly. And Schlafly becomes a really powerful conservative force in the 1970s through her work to against the Equal Rights Amendment. So this is also part of, within the Guerrilla Girls game, this is part of your recent history, that the ERA was actually defeated by other women. And that's connected to the question, why have there been no great women artists? Because one of the possible answers that Nochlin says, no, we can't, this can't be the answer. Nochlin says, is it just this golden nugget of genius that we're waiting for an individual woman to exhibit? I think Schlafly would say yes, right? Because Schlafly is all about individualism. She says there's no systemic sexism, that it's simply the work of each individual woman to have a positive outlook and to succeed individually. And I think that's a very appealing message, as many of you noted. So these 2 perspectives, you know, Phyllis Schlafly doesn't care about art. She's not an art critic, but her perspective on individualism rather than looking at structural forces or cultural forces, I think is very influential in those answers of why has there been no great woman artist that Nochlin asked in 71. So I wanted to get us a little bit grounded in that Guerrilla Girls period. Like I said, Reaganomics, trickle-down economics, Cold War proliferation, AIDS crisis, war on drugs, all of these are happening in New York in the midst of the Guerrilla Girls game. So let me go ahead and give a brief-ish lecture on the new rights to get us into the 80s, to get us to talk about the war on drugs and the AIDS crisis. I'm gonna make sure I'm recording. I am. All right. I'm going to go here, start a slideshow from the beginning. Okay, great. So we talked a lot about the 60s, and we skipped the anti-Vietnam protests. The song that I was playing as you came in was Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, Ohio, a story about the 4 college students who were killed in Kent State in 1970 when the National Guard opened fire on Vietnam War protesters. So we talked a lot in the last couple of weeks about the development of the new right, largely rooted in civil rights movements, women's liberation, the Chicanx movement, largely rooted in youth organizations like the Students for a Democratic Society. Today, we're going to talk about the new right, in part as a reaction against that new left that we explored. And Phyllis Schlafly will be our grounding into the new right. She'll be what we're most familiar with, either because you've already read her, or maybe you've been watching Mrs. America or watched with us on Monday. So you might already be familiar with Phyllis Schlafly. So let's talk a little bit more in depth about what's new about the new right. So to understand the new right of the 70s and the 80s, first we have to understand the older new right. We're on there's so many new rights here. But the older new right develops in the 50s and the 60s as part of that anti-communist movement. And it's in many ways a continuation of conservative trends that we've seen in American history, focus on localism, global interventionism, explicitly to fight communism here, and the economic ideas of classic liberalism, laissez-faire, hands-off economy, right? That the free market should be left uninhibited by government intervention. Now, these traditions can best be seen in the 1950s in the National Review. And I always say it's just National Review. Have you heard of National Review? It's a publication. Give me like a thumbs up or a wave if you have ever heard of this publication.
No.
No, nobody? If you are interested in, and I think everyone should be interested in getting a variety of sources, this is one that I would recommend. So if you're interested in reading a wide variety of different perspectives on news and events, I would recommend folding in the National Review. You're going to get a lot of op-eds from really, really classic conservatives on the right. So that's something that I would look into, or at least follow some people on Twitter from National Review if you're interested in a broad range of ideas. So National Review becomes in '55, it's founded by William F. Buckley, and it becomes the gold standard of American conservative thought, and it remains the gold standard for many, many years. If you're also interested in like the conservative movement today and changes and conversations within the conservative movement today, I would also read National Review. In 2016, National Review became the home of some, they call themselves Never Trumpers, conservatives who are opposed to President Trump. National Review is where you're going to find some op-eds from those conservatives. So again, if you're interested in that inner party or inner conservative debate, National Review is a good place to look for that. So National Review, we can think of as like the old new right. Localism, classic liberalism, interventionism, and it's joined in the 70s and the 80s, so it doesn't go anywhere, right? These people are still part of the conservative movement. There's still influence here. But in the 70s and the 80s, it's joined by the new right. I'm gonna skip some of that. Which takes on a much more populist bent in the 70s and the 80s. It takes a focus on identity politics, as something we talk a lot about now. And here that is particularly a Christian identity, particularly the religious right, suburban, rural identity. And the new right also emerges using grassroots networks that have been created in the 50s and the 60s, oftentimes by women who took over like local PTAs and school boards and became politically active. Conservative women became politically active that way. Sorry, these birds are wild. I gotta shut the door. Oh my God. These birds are like driving, okay, shush. What was I saying? Yes, so the new right builds a coalition of the religious right, classic liberals, and it pulls in voters on these wedge issues, single voter issues. If I say single voter issue or single issue voter, like someone is a single issue voter, they vote on one issue. What might some single issues be that people vote on? I'm gonna drink some coffee while you chat. Put it in the chat box or unmute yourself. Nothing? No single issues? You don't know any single issue voters? What might be something that someone cares about so much that regardless of what the rest of the message is, regardless of the rest of the policies, they'll vote for someone based on one issue? Kinda, Isabel? That's a little broad. I like it, but it's a little broad. Let's be sensible. That would be really sensible, Favor. That would also be sensible. Y'all are too sensible. Y'all are like thinking really big stuff, really complex ideas. Funny. People often don't vote for their economic interests. That's one of the weird things about politics. Likability. Oh, what about, no, it's not necessarily insensible. It's just smaller than what y'all are thinking. It's more specific. Single issue voters. Healthcare is one that's emerging. Isabel, I think healthcare is an emerging single issue. Not in the 70s and the 80s, but I think today that's one that's emerging. That there's a lot of people who will vote on healthcare specifically. But in the 70s and the 80s, and these are still true today, you're thinking abortion, Second Amendment. For a while, same-sex marriage became a single issue that people would vote on. And that didn't last. And I think part of why that didn't last is that opposition to same-sex marriage doesn't comfortably work with a lot of other conservative perspectives. So that seemed like it came and went. But if you're thinking things like abortion, that has endured as a single issue that people will just vote. They say, I don't care about any other issue. I vote on this. But I think you're right that healthcare is an emerging issue. That people will say, I just vote on this issue. Climate change might be an emerging single issue, wedge issue. These change and develop, but abortion's endured in part because it is really, the anti-abortion movement is really ran primarily by women. It's become, in the 70s and the 80s, it became a single issue that a lot of women specifically cared about. And you can think too that it's, for many people, rooted in religion, that it's very personal, that it's very emotional, not like that's a bad thing, but like that's something that people care about. And I think that's why it's endured in a way that other single issues haven't necessarily. But yeah, I think for our time, gun rights / gun control, healthcare, I think, is an emerging issue. Like I said, climate change, I think, is an emerging issue that people will just say, this is what I vote based on. I don't vote for a large policy platform. I vote on this issue. In the 70s and the 80s, oh my God, now the cat is stuck outside. Oh, it's quite a day on the porch. These single issues became wedge issues to pull people into the Republican Party, that the Republican Party did a really skillful job of creating a coalition of these single issues: anti-abortion, anti-communism, anti-integration in the South, and around the country for a lot of women, anti-ERA. The Equal Rights Amendment was a proposed constitutional amendment. It was passed by Congress, but the states, it was never ratified by 38 states, which it needed to be. And if you are watching Mrs. America, you know that the ERA was largely defeated by the work of Phyllis Schlafly. The ERA that says, it's a constitutional amendment that says there can't be sex discrimination based on sex or gender. And it's largely defeated by women. And Phyllis Schlafly really leads this effort. Now, Phyllis Schlafly does not she wants women to succeed. She's educated herself. She wants individual women to go to law school, to go to medical school. She supports that. But she says an Equal Right Amendment, women will lose special protections. So Schlafly isn't against women's rights, but she's more interested in the privileges that women, especially middle-class white women like herself, have. So she says if the Equal Rights Amendment passes, women are going to get drafted. Women are going to have to pay alimony to their husbands if they get divorced. Women are going to lose custody of children in divorce. She says if the Equal Rights Amendment passes, you will lose privileges. And this message is very appealing to a lot of women, especially conservative women, especially conservative white women who felt left out of the feminist movement. Betty Friedan says, being stuck in the house is like a quiet concentration camp, a terrible quote that she later disavowed. But you can imagine that a homemaker would be like, well, I like my life. Friedan later says, like, I really missed it there. I totally biffed it. I didn't reach out to those women. I didn't connect with them. Schlafly does. Schlafly says, feminists are trying to take away your privileges. She says, feminism is going to make your daughters get drafted into a war. She's also homophobic. So she says feminism is going to lead to lesbianism. and she's on the assumption here that being a lesbian is a bad thing. But this message is appealing, this anti-ERA message. And on the anti-ERA message, or on that anti-ERA movement, the anti-abortion movement builds, right? And within both of these, the boogeyman, the elite, that, remember, populism as a political style, you have to have an elite. The elite here is feminists. Schlafly calls them, oh God, what does she call them? Like liberal Northeast elites, those feminists, right? And that's a message that really connects with a lot of women who felt like, I don't think feminism is for me. I don't think Friedan is talking to me. Like I said, Friedan's later like, I was talking to you, but I didn't do a good job of it. Other stuff. If you haven't, I've only watched the first episode of Mrs. America. I don't know if I can do the whole thing, but Cate Blanchett, so wave or do the thumbs up if you have seen any episodes of Mrs. America. Like, nobody. I'm missing, nope. Amanda, you've seen it. Did you wander away? All right. I think it's—
thumbs up is up.
Okay, gotcha. All right. If you do watch any of Mrs. America, or even if you see like a preview, Cate Blanchett absolutely nails Phyllis Schlafly's style. She's enormously intelligent. She's very educated. She's actually a foreign policy expert. She's an expert on nuclear armaments, and she wants to go to Congress. She wants to be in Congress to influence America's foreign policy. If she was born a man, she probably would have written for the National Review. If she was born a man, she would have been William F. Buckley. But she finds that conservative men will not listen to her, that her expertise is not taken seriously on foreign policy and nuclear armament. So there's this great irony that Schlafly denies sexism. She says, sexism isn't real. I've never experienced discrimination. But the great irony is, because of the discrimination she faces as a woman who's an expert on foreign policy, because men won't listen to her on that, she pivots, because conservative men will listen to her if she's anti-ERA. So it's so ironic. Sexism pushes her into a path to power, that she only gets power if she denies sexism is real. It's amazing. Like I said, Cate Blanchett nails this performance, because Phyllis Schlafly, she's poised, she's so articulate, and she's practicing this political style that we're familiar with. We watched nighttime talking head news, which is this rapid fire talking points, just one after another. She does not deviate. Now, in '76, Friedan shows up to debate her. Friedan's also very smart, very intelligent, but she doesn't have that style of Schlafly, and she doesn't know how to respond to it. She's like, what are you doing? Why? Those talking points, I've already told you those aren't true. But Phyllis Schlafly just keeps up with it. We're going to watch a couple of minutes. I like this clip because it shows that Schlafly style. It shows that Friedan really just misses it on how to respond to her. And I also like that it's three women talking about the ERA on Good Morning America. So we'll just watch a little clip. Maybe. Yes.
Some felt that progress was made for women and that it was successful, while others argued that absolutely nothing was accomplished, that there were major setbacks, beginning with the stalemating of the Federal Equal Rights Amendment and the crushing state defeats in New York and New Jersey. In order for the Equal Rights Amendment to become the 27th Amendment to the Constitution, 38 states must ratify it by March of 1979. Already 34 have, however, 2 of those 34, Tennessee and Nebraska, have rescinded it, thus ending up in court order decisions. Now, we're going to discuss the Equal Rights Amendment with 2 ladies here. One is a proponent and one is an opponent to it. An opponent to the Equal Rights Amendment is Phyllis Schlafly, National Chairman for the Stop ERA. She is publisher of the Phyllis Schlafly Report and the author of A Choice, Not an Echo. And the proponent to the Equal Rights Amendment is one of the country's most leading feminists. I'm talking about Betty Friedan. She is the author to The Feminine Mystique. Before we get into talking about the pros and cons of the Equal Rights Amendment, I think for the benefit of our viewers, it might be kind of interesting to see what it says here in the Equal Rights Amendment. It's very short. When you think of amending the Constitution, something that's very serious, you think that it's lengthy and complicated. The amendment reads as follows. Section 1. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Section 2. The Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. Section 3. This amendment shall take effect 2 years after the date of ratification. As you can see, it's pretty brief. It's only 52 words. So is the Equal Rights Amendment too vague? Or does the Equal Rights Amendment simply extend women's rights to men, thus equalizing them? What is your opinion? Betty, can we hear from you?
Well, you see, I think we simply must, and I think we should do it rightfully in 1976, 200th year of the Republic, get the Constitution equally applied to women. I mean, we know now, we've spent 10 years really delineating all the areas where sex discrimination exists. Discrimination basically against women, but some ways that men are victims of it too. And we've got a lot of laws that have we've made some gains to say that it is wrong to have sex discrimination in employment, in education, in pay, in mortgage, in credit, in all these things, even in sports against women. But these laws are not being enforced. And with the economic crisis that we're in now, where, you know, really inflation is giving and layoffs are really facing women with hard times, there's danger even that some of the programs and laws against sex discrimination will be removed. And we need the constitutional guarantee of equality. And we also need it because there are a great many people, especially housewives, who really are discriminated against, whose all the work they have done in the home to help build up whatever income the total family has and so on and so forth. There is no law that now exists that makes those women who have been working as housewives insured in their own right for old age, for Social Security. There's no insurance that if that marriage should end in divorce, as it is for all too many people, that woman's contribution will be considered equally in the disposition of the property. And there is no provision even really, as it is now, to enforce child support, much less alimony for women. We really absolutely need the Equal Rights Amendment to enable all the young women and men that are coming out of law school now to create new bodies of law that will really protect women.
When you make the laws apply equally to men and women, you end up taking away many of the rights that women now have. For example, the Equal Rights Amendment will make our young women subject to the draft and military combat the next time we have one of these wars that we have every 10 years, because no longer could you have it just apply to males, it would have to apply equally to females. And then ERA is a big attack on the rights of the homemaker. The laws of every state make it the obligation of the husband to support his wife, to provide her with a home, to support their minor children. The woman in the home can draw Social Security benefits based on her husband's earnings, even though she's been a homemaker all her life. Now, all these things will be lost when you apply a rule that says that everything must be equal. Now, until you can make it equal for men to have the babies just like women, then it is a double burden to the women to say that the rules for family support should be equal on the husband and the wife.
So this is the message that really resonates with a lot of married women, especially those white middle class women who do have economic security based on their husband's income. And for instance, Friedan says it's wrong that women can't apply for credit cards on their own. That women could not, if you were unmarried, you could not apply for a credit card, even if you had a job. If you were married, your husband had to apply for the credit card. You had to get his signature. Friedan says this is really unjust, that women can't apply for credit. Schlafly says, no, what's happening is that women have the privilege of using their husband's income for credit. So it's the same issue. Friedan says this is inequitable, this is unjust. Schlafly says, no, it's actually a privilege that women can apply for credit under their husband's name. Now, notice that Schlafly's privileges largely leave out unmarried women, that unmarried women do not get those privileges that Schlafly is saying. Schlafly also says, like you see here, women are going to get drafted, and women are going to have to pay alimony if you get divorced. And these are the privileges that she wants women to keep. And this is the message that defeats the ERA. You know, Schlafly's part of the religious right. She's part of this charismatic Catholicism that becomes aligned with the right in the 70s and the 80s. And when we talk about that religious alignment, we think about people like Jerry Falwell. Jerry Falwell pulled together anti-communism, anti-abortion, a belief in laissez-faire economics, and support for Reagan into one neat package, right? He pulled it all together and he said, these are all the same thing. If you like one of these, you like the rest of them too. And in this 1979 speech that he gives, he says that there is a moral majority in America who are quietly disapproving of cultural and political trends on the left. And he taps into that, like I said, to create this coalition that will support Reagan. And the rise of Reagan is absolutely dependent on the support of that emerging religious right. I'm not going to talk a lot about Reagan, although we're also not going to watch the speech today. The other thing, before we get to Reagan, the other thing I want to talk about is the Southern strategy. There's a shift in the South that as the Democratic Party becomes the party of civil rights, white conservatives don't support that. It's actually too much to say that, like, oh, the party switched. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a much more gradual process, but it is part a grassroots change and part this Southern strategy that Atwater describes here, that if we can tap into that white resistance to integration, if we can tap into those mobs that attack the Little Rock Nine, we can switch them. But you can't say, as Atwater says, by the 1970s, by the 1980s, you can't say I don't want Black people to vote. He says, instead, we'll talk about busing. Instead, we'll talk about welfare queens. And if you look at the actual voting patterns, you'll see, like, wait a second, people didn't start voting for Republicans until 15 years after the Civil Rights Movement. In part, that's because Democrats in the South who were conservative, why don't they just, so members of Congress, why don't they just switch parties in 1965? Because if you're a member of Congress, you might hold important positions on various congressional committees. There's these really important influential positions, and they're largely based on seniority. If you switch parties, you lose that position. You gotta basically start over. So what we see instead is Southern conservatives, instead of becoming officially Republican, they begin voting with Republicans long before they switch party affiliation. So it's a much more gradual and interesting process in the South. And that process has come to its fruition by the time you get to Reagan. And Reagan comes to power on this broad coalition of the religious rights, classic conservatives, Southern people who had been Dixiecrats who are now Republicans. And we're not going to talk a lot about Reagan, although you can watch the crash course and other stuff if you're interested. I want to talk instead the trickle-down economics, the idea that if you give rich people a tax break, that money will trickle down. That's like Reaganomics. That's old. It's never worked. You could see that it grew the deficit. The deficit grew under Reagan, even during an economic boom. You're probably aware of that. I want to talk specifically about Reagan's response to the AIDS crisis. So AIDS activists will actually lambaste Reagan because the Reagan administration really failed to act for half a decade. So for about 5 years, failed to act on the emerging epidemic of HIV and AIDS. One of the groups most critical, they made this poster obviously, is ACT UP. That is the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. So like Reagan, he didn't invent HIV. He didn't give anyone HIV. Why does he get so much blame? Because he failed to respond. And part of why the White House failed to respond is that the earliest HIV victims in America were gay men. And there was a lot of homophobia at play here. And some, like Falwell, believed that this was from God. And that really sort of toxic view on what HIV was led to there not being a response for years. So there's an early doctor, Dr. Marcus Conant. He's one of the first physicians to treat HIV and AIDS, one of the first to diagnose it. And he goes to the White House in 1983. And he talks to the White House liaison for medical care. So this is the White House health expert, right? This is someone who should care about health and medical care. And he's talking, he says he's going on and on about how this is a disease, an infectious disease. And the response of the healthcare liaison, she said, quote, "This is a legal problem, not a medical problem." She said, quote, "These people are breaking the law." She says, because the early victims are a lot of gay men, she says, oh, the issue isn't the disease. The issue is they're breaking the law. She's talking about sodomy laws here. She says, that's the issue, that they're breaking the law, not that there's this disease. Of course, that HIV doesn't stay unique to men who have sex with other men. This epidemic is growing, but this homophobia really affects the lack of response. So that was in 83. In 87, Conant, once again, he writes to the president and he says, 21,000 people have died of this epidemic, and the Center for Disease Control and the National Institutes of Health have to coordinate a response to this. And he says that he got a letter back that said, and he quotes, "Nancy and I thank you for your support." So he gets back a form letter, right? And that's why it's like, yeah, Reagan's not out here trying to give people HIV, right? But his failure to respond led to this unchecked growth of the epidemic in the early 80s. And here you see some of those ACT UP activists. This is one of the most famous images. If I die of AIDS, forget burial, just drop my body on the steps of the FDA. And here we have some ACT UP members doing what they called a die-in. So instead of a sit-in, it's a die-in. They would lay on the ground as if they were dead to get attention to this unchecked epidemic. And what they were asking for was more money put to investigating drug treatments, more education into how to prevent the spread of HIV, and they weren't getting that. This 1989 poster says, by 1989, there's going to be 55,000 people that have died of AIDS. And this should say Bush administration, because 1989, we're in Bush 1. All right, I'm gonna shift to something that's related, and we're gonna end here on the war on drugs. We'll talk about for maybe like 15 minutes or so. So first of all, I made this slide purple because the war on drugs is a bipartisan effort that we associate it with Nixon and Reagan and George H.W. Bush, all Republicans, but Carter and Clinton, Democrats are in on this too, right? This is actually a bipartisan problem that the solution probably needs to be bipartisan as well. If you read that ACLU's position paper on race and the war on drugs, you're going to see that the ACLU also connects the war on drugs with the AIDS crisis. And here's how. One of the ways that you stop the spread of HIV, one of the ways that people get HIV is through sharing needles. So people that do intravenous drugs share needles. They could be passing HIV to others. So one of the ways that you control the spread of HIV is through these clean needle programs. So basically a program that says you can go somewhere and hand in needles and get clean needles. And no one's going to arrest you, right? Because it's more important to stop the spread of HIV. That idea, though, is in direct opposition to the war on drugs. The war on drugs is more important to stop IV drug use. So you have to not have needle exchanges. It says needle exchanges just support drug use. So these two things are actually in opposition to each other, which is a point that the ACLU makes. And we do see when needle exchange programs are halted, like they were in Indiana a few years ago, we do see an acceleration in the spread of HIV. But the war on drugs says we can't be using taxpayer money to give people clean needles. The war against HIV, not the war, but the fight against HIV says, but it will prevent the spread. So the ACLU paper will talk about that a little bit more. Now, like I said, this is a bipartisan issue, although we associate it with Nixon and Reagan and H.W. Bush especially. But the anti-drug laws go back further, of course. Anti-opium laws in the 1870s were directed at Chinese immigrants. Anti-cocaine laws were directed in the South against Black men. Anti-marijuana laws were targeted at Mexican migrants and Mexican Americans who were associated with these drugs, even though, as the ACLU points out, they don't do drugs more than white people do. 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was the first criminalization or step towards criminalizing marijuana. And you may, so that was in 37. And like, what did people think marijuana was like? Okay, who's seen Reefer Madness? Do a little wave or a thumb up. No, it's Mia. Everyone's like, I'm not gonna tell her I've seen Reefer Madness. All right, we're gonna watch the trailer for Reefer Madness. 1936, this film is about marijuana, it's about weed. All right, let's watch a clip.
These high school boys and girls are having a hop at the local soda fountain. Innocently, they dance. Innocent of a new and deadly menace lurking behind closed doors. Marijuana, the burning weed with its roots in hell. In this film, you will see the ease with which this vicious plant can be grown in your neighbor's yard, rolled into harmless-looking cigarettes, hidden in an innocent shoe or watch case. In this startling film, you will see dopesters lure children to destruction.
We're going over to Joe's place. Why don't you come along? We have a date to play a set of doubles. Oh, you can play anytime. Come on, we'll have some laughs. Can I go along with you? Sure. Hey, I'll see you at dinner, sis.
If you want a good smoke, try one of these.
You will meet Bill, who once took pride in his strong will as he takes the first step toward enslavement.
Of course, if you're afraid.
Smoking the soul-destroying reefer, they find a moment's pleasure, but at a terrible price. Debauchery, violence, murder, suicide. And the ultimate end of the marijuana addict. Hopeless insanity. See this important film now, before it is too late.
So yes, the devil's weed with its roots in hell. I think accurate, right? Really accurate. I think everyone's probably seen someone smoke a joint and then play piano maniacally, faster and faster until ultimately they throw themselves out of a window. This is not rooted in reality. I'm gonna butcher an Office joke here, a joke from The Office, when I say, you know, the director of Reefer Madness, I don't think he's ever done drugs. I don't think anyone's ever offered him any. Such a good quote from The Office. But there's this real silliness here, like what? But this is part of building support for anti-drug laws. And you know, of course, here we're making fun of Reefer Madness, but you know there are drugs that are devastating to people's lives, right? That's very real. You know, being against the war on drugs, which if it isn't obvious, I am, doesn't mean support for, you know, people shooting up heroin. It says that there are better ways, or I would say, and others would say, there are better ways at stopping like the opioid crisis than simply arresting more and more people, because that's the end result of the war on drugs. more and more people are arrested, and sentences get longer and longer, especially as judges have to abide by mandatory minimum sentencing. So you can see here that the war on drugs has absolutely exploded our prison population. So it's connected to the prison industrial complex as well. And you can see here that the prison population in America has grown 800%. Per capita, we have more citizens in prison than anyone else, including the very despotic Turkey, which also puts a lot of people in prison, including members of the press that are critical of the government. So, like, you know, we're being worse than legitimately tyrannical governments with our prison population, and part of this is related to the war on drugs. Americans have not become 800% more criminal since the 1920s. And in fact, we see a rise in violent crime in the 1920s and the 1990s, but violent crime in America has steadily declined since the 1990s, even as our prison population numbers have grown. The war on drugs helps us understand that. And if we think about responses to drug use, you might think of Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign, aimed at children to just say no to drugs. Again, this puts the onus of responsibility on the individual, and that's certainly appropriate in a lot of cases, right? It is individuals' responsibilities to make good choices about themselves and their health, but it's not a structural response, right? It's a response to a growing, like if you think about the opioid crisis, just say no isn't going to cut it. If you think about, so Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign is one of those responses to the war on drugs that focuses on not even so much education as just individual responsibility. The, oh gosh, what's the, I had to do it. I know some students, no, I didn't have to do it. I was in the Just Say No generation, but later, I think it's called the DARE, D-A-R-E. Is that the one that you take in elementary school? Or yeah, if you have little kids, they might be doing some version of this. I know my son came home from first grade and announced to me that I'm never going to eat drugs. And I said, all right, good for you. I remind him of that a lot, but he's never going to eat drugs. Okay, so if you have kids in school or you went to school more recently, you probably did the DARE program. That is more about education. And of course, you know that teenagers and others, they have campaigns about, for instance, the youth of crystal meth that are about frightening people, right? Have you seen those? What are those ads? What do they call them? Let's look for them. Let's see what Google finds. I haven't Googled this before, so I'm a little bit nervous. Anti-meth ad. Let's just look for that. Yeah, this looks horrifying. Okay, there we go. This is terrifying, right? This is terrifying. Now, on the one hand, I'm gonna stop watching that. That's really, oh, wait, sorry. I stopped, no, sharing, good. All right, this is what I get for clicking around. Okay, so those terrifying images of methamphetamine use, you know, they're aimed at young people to sort of frighten them away from meth use, but critics have said, as devastating as an addiction to methamphetamine can be, like crystal meth, this lecture is me like, end the war on drugs and don't do drugs, right? But even though, you know, use of crystal methamphetamine is devastating, it's devastated communities, it's devastated individuals and families, but critics say that those ads are actually the wrong way to go about it. Critics say if you show young people an ad that says, this is what it looks like to take crystal meth, and then they do crystal meth and don't have these immediate consequences, they're going to be like, oh, wait, that was totally overblown. This is fine. So over-exaggerating the consequences can actually be detrimental, because students will then think like, oh, wait, this is all dumb. DARE, at least it used to, this might not be true. DARE presented things like marijuana use, even drinking, as a path, that idea of marijuana as a gateway drug. that idea can actually be detrimental, because again, if you say weed is a gateway drug, and then someone smokes weed and is like, wait, I haven't been playing the piano crazily or jumping out any windows, it calls the rest of it into doubt. So ideas like that can actually be detrimental. It can make someone say, oh, the rest of that must be nonsense too. Because, you know, I had a beer underage, or I smoked a joint and I didn't have these detrimental consequences. So it's complex is what I'm saying. It's so complicated. We have been at war with drugs for 50 years and we have not won. We have an opioid crisis. What is definitely not working is sending more and more people to jail. But that's been the overarching response to drug use in this country is criminalizing people, criminalizing some drugs differently than others. For instance, crack. Crack is a form of cocaine. So it comes in crack, like little rocks. That's about the extent of my knowledge. Form. Okay, raise your hand or wave or thumbs up if you have heard that crack is more powerful or potent or more dangerous than powder form cocaine. You have heard that. You've heard that. You've heard that. You've heard that. You have not heard that. There's no science to support that. Now, crack is cheaper, so you might end up buying more and using more, right? But there's no science to say that crack is significantly more potent than powder form cocaine. But crack in the 80s became associated with African Americans and became criminalized more heavily than the powder form of cocaine. And this was devastating, especially when you're talking mandatory minimums. What you have in the 1980s is if you're caught with crack cocaine, you have a mandatory minimum of a 10-year sentence. 10 years for crack cocaine. On September 5th, 1989, President George H.W. Bush, Bush 1, made a televised speech from the Oval Office announcing his administration's escalation of the war on drugs. And to illustrate the gravity of the situation, he's in the Oval Office and he holds up a bag of crack cocaine and he says, this crack was purchased just steps from the White House. He says this was purchased right outside of the White House. That's how bad it is. There's a problem. No one is selling drugs in front of the White House. Like literally no one. Have you been to the White House? Like it's not like a shaded area. There's not a lot of little nooks and crannies. No one is selling drugs in front of the White House. That's totally nonsense. Here's what happened. The DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, lured a dealer from another part of the city to the White House. There's a young man, 18-year-old high school senior. His name was Keith Jackson. And he is sometimes an informant for the DEA. That's how they know him. And they say, you know, come to the White House, meet us here. So he comes to meet them, and he's never even been to this part of DC. He says, where the fuck is the White House? Excuse my language, but it's a direct quote. And they're like, it's right there, it's over there. And then they arrest him. And he's found guilty, and he faces a mandatory 10 years in jail. The judge in his sentencing has no choice. The judge cannot give him another sentence. He has to give him 10 years. So the judge says, Bush, so this is all quoting, Bush used you in the sense of making a big drug speech, but Bush is a decent man. He's a man of great compassion, and he can find a way to reduce that sentence. When Bush was asked, are you going to reduce Keith Jackson's sentence? He says, the man went there and sold drugs in front of the White House, didn't he? I can't feel sorry for this fellow. Jackson was in jail until he was 27. He spent the next 10 years of his life in jail. This is not, now Keith Jackson's, of course, an exceptional story because he was lured to the White House by the DEA so H.W. Bush could make a cool speech. The White House said, we did not tell the DEA to do this. That's very suspicious because there's really no other good reason for the DEA to have done this. This is like a very weird thing to have done. But the White House at the time says, no, we didn't do that. So Keith Jackson is unique because of that, but he's not unique in getting a sentence of 10 years for selling crack cocaine when a sentence for powder cocaine was 1 year. Actually, double check me on that. I think it's 1 year, but I don't have it in my notes. It's a lot less. And this is what grows or explodes that prison population. And you can see here, I had to update this because immigration detention has just about doubled in the last 2 years. So I had to update this for 2020. But you can see here the various categories, the number of youth, who's in local jails. People in local jails are awaiting trial, and they can stay in local jails for years. So there's been the prison activists talk about that are in jail who have not been found guilty, but are left in local jails for years awaiting trial. And it's one of the ways that people are pressured to take a plea deal. Because if you don't take a plea deal, you sit in jail waiting for your trial. And activists have argued that this is unconstitutional to hold people in jail when they haven't been, when they don't have like you can't make people wait this long for a trial basically and still hold them. And you can see that state prisons hold the bulk of incarcerated people. And a majority, actually I need to look up the figures, so I'm not gonna say majority, I'm gonna be a little more cautious there. Many prisons are private, and so they're for profit, they're profit-making enterprises. So this has created a huge and profitable industry because of these mandatory minimums and because so many people are here. You can see it's almost 200,000 people in state prisons for drugs. Here we have 45,000 people in state prisons for drug possession. These are not dealers, or at least they were not found guilty of being dealers. These are people who are in state prison for drug possession. And you can see here in the local jails, the drugs also are a huge chunk of this. 120,000 people are in jail for these nonviolent offenses. So these are all nonviolent